Behind the ornate mahogany doors of Beacon Hill's most prestigious mansions, a photographer's darkroom revealed horrors that Boston's elite would kill to keep buried. In 1887, Edgar Hartwell, a renowned memento mori specialist, developed what he believed would be routine post-mortem portraits of the wealthy Pemberton patriarch. Instead, his silver nitrate plates captured evidence of the most calculated murder in Massachusetts history. What started as a family's final tribute to their deceased father became a deadly game of survival when Hartwell's photographs revealed bite marks on the corpse's fingernails, defensive wounds carefully concealed by funeral makeup, and most disturbing of all, the unmistakable expression of a man who knew his killers intimately. The Pemberton fortune, worth over $2 million in today's currency, had been secured through matricide, and the family would stop at nothing to ensure their photographer never left Boston alive. Before we continue with the story of Edgar Hartwell and the photographs that exposed Boston's darkest family secret, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. Now, let's discover how a simple memorial session became a fight for survival in the gaslit streets of Victorian Boston. The winter winds of 1887 howled through Boston's cobblestone streets, carrying with them the scent of coal smoke and the whispered scandals of high society. Beacon Hill stood as the crown jewel of New England aristocracy, where families like the Pembertons had built their empires through shipping, textile mills, and the blood money of questionable business practices. The neighborhood's federal-style mansions, with their distinctive purple-paned windows and wrought-iron balconies, housed secrets as old as the Republic itself. Edgar Hartwell had established his photography studio on Washington Street 3 years prior, specializing in the delicate art of memento mori photography. In an era when death was a constant companion and medical photography was still in its infancy, families of means sought to preserve their final moments with departed loved ones through carefully composed post-mortem portraits. Hartwell's reputation had grown among Boston's elite, not merely for his technical skill with the large format cameras and silver nitrate development process, but for his discretion and sensitivity during families' most vulnerable moments. The photographer was a methodical man in his early 40s, with calloused hands stained permanently by developer chemicals and eyes that had witnessed more grief than most clergymen. His studio occupied the second floor of a narrow brick building, where heavy velvet drapes blocked the harsh New England light and allowed him complete control over his illumination. The workshop was arranged with scientific precision, developing trays arranged by size, bottles of chemicals labeled in his careful handwriting, and glass plates stored in felt-lined boxes to prevent the slightest scratch that could ruin hours of work. Hartwell took pride in his craft, understanding that these portraits often became families' most treasured possessions, displayed prominently in parlors as both memorial and proof of their devotion to the deceased. His clientele consisted primarily of Boston's established families, those whose names appeared regularly in the society pages and whose influence extended from the State House to the exclusive Somerset Club. These were people who valued tradition and appearance above all else, who understood that a proper memorial portrait was as essential as an elaborate funeral service. Hartwell had photographed the deceased patriarchs of shipping dynasties, the beloved matriarchs of banking families, and the tragic young victims of consumption who had succumbed despite their family's wealth and the best medical care money could buy. Boston in 1887 was a city caught between old traditions and industrial progress. The Back Bay had been filled and developed into a showcase of Victorian architecture, while the harbor bristled with steamships bringing immigrants and goods from across the Atlantic. Electric streetlights were beginning to appear on major thoroughfares, though most residential areas still relied on gas lamps that cast dancing shadows and created pools of amber light in the evening darkness. Telegraph lines crisscrossed the city like a metallic web, carrying news and business communications at unprecedented speed. Yet beneath the veneer of prosperity and progress, the established families clung fiercely to their social positions, their wealth, and their secrets. Marriage was business, Inheritance was warfare, and reputation was everything. The nouveau riche industrialists might build grander mansions and throw more elaborate parties, but they could never quite achieve the social acceptance that came with generations of Boston pedigree. This tension between old money and new created an atmosphere of constant competition and barely concealed hostility among the city's elite. The Pemberton family embodied this complex dynamic perfectly. Cornelius Pemberton had built his fortune through a combination of shrewd investments, strategic marriages, and business practices that would have scandalized the public had they ever come to light. His textile mills employed hundreds of immigrant workers under conditions that barely met legal standards, while his shipping interests had profited handsomely from trade routes that skirted the edges of international law. By 1887, at age 73, Cornelius controlled an empire worth nearly $40,000, making him one of the wealthiest men in Massachusetts. His influence extended far beyond mere financial holdings. Cornelius served on the boards of 3 banks, held significant interests in the Boston and Maine Railroad, and maintained silent partnerships in several of the city's most prestigious law firms. Politicians sought his endorsement, ministers welcomed his generous contributions, and business rivals feared his capacity for economic warfare. He had survived the Panic of 1873, emerging stronger while lesser men faced bankruptcy, and his reputation for ruthless efficiency was matched only by his family's social prominence. His Beacon Hill mansion reflected this prosperity in every detail. The 4-story brownstone featured hand-carved marble staircases imported from Italy, crystal chandeliers from Vienna that scattered rainbow light across polished surfaces, and a library containing first editions that scholars would have killed to examine. Persian rugs covered floors of Honduras mahogany, while oil paintings by European masters adorned walls covered in hand-printed silk wallpaper from France. The house employed 12 full-time servants, from the Irish cook who had worked for the family for 2 decades to the German butler who managed the household with military precision. The telegram arrived at Hartwell's studio on a grey February morning, delivered by a boy whose boots left muddy prints across the photographer's carefully maintained floors. The message was brief and formal. Cornelius Pemberton deceased. Family requests immediate memorial photography. Highest compensation assured. Pemberton residence, Beacon Hill. Urgent attention required. The paper bore the Pemberton family seal, pressed into dark blue wax with the authority of generations. Hartwell recognized the name immediately. The Pemberton family was Boston royalty, their influence extending from the State House to the city's most exclusive social clubs. This commission would not only provide substantial income, but also cement his reputation among the city's most elite circles. He gathered his equipment methodically. The large format camera with its brass fittings and leather bellows, glass plate holders wrapped in felt, bottles of developer and fixer sealed with cork and wax, and the portable lighting apparatus that allowed him to work in clients' homes. The journey to Beacon Hill took him through streets lined with elm trees, whose bare branches created intricate patterns against the overcast sky. Horse-drawn carriages navigated the cobblestones carefully, their wheels creating a rhythmic clatter that echoed off the brick facades of Federal-style townhouses. Gas lamps stood like sentinels along the sidewalks, their glass globes fogged with condensation from the morning's humidity. The Pemberton mansion stood like a fortress against the gray February sky, its windows reflecting the bare branches of elm trees that lined the street. 4 stories of dark brownstone rose from a foundation of granite blocks, each floor marked by rows of tall windows framed in white painted wood. Iron railings decorated with intricate scrollwork guarded the front steps, while a brass nameplate beside the heavy oak door proclaimed the family's residence with understated authority. Hartwell knocked on the door, his breath forming small clouds in the bitter air. The sound echoed within the house, followed by the measured footsteps of someone approaching. The butler who answered was a thin, nervous man with prematurely gray hair and hands that trembled slightly as he took the photographer's coat. His movements carried the precision of long service, yet there was an underlying tension in his posture that spoke of recent stress. "Mr. Hartwell, I presume?" the butler said, his German accent barely detectable after years of careful cultivation. "I am Wilhelm Kraus. The family is distraught, as you might imagine. They are gathered in the morning room, but Mr. Pemberton's remains are prepared in the master bedroom." The house felt oppressive despite its grandeur. Heavy draperies blocked most natural light, while gas fixtures cast dancing shadows on the walls papered in deep burgundy silk. The air carried a mixture of expensive cologne, fresh flowers from the conservatory, and something else. A metallic scent that Hartwell's experience told him was likely the result of hasty embalming. The floors creaked softly under their feet despite the thick Persian carpets, and every surface gleamed with the kind of meticulous polish that required an army of servants. As they climbed the marble staircase, its banister carved from a single piece of mahogany and polished to mirror brightness, Kraus spoke in hushed tones about the family's grief and their desire for privacy during this difficult time. His words carried the practiced cadence of a man accustomed to managing visitors during times of crisis, yet there was something forced about his manner, as if he were reciting lines from a play rather than expressing genuine sentiment. The second-floor corridor stretched in both directions, lined with portraits of Pemberton ancestors whose stern faces seemed to follow their progress. Oil paintings in gilt frames depicted ship captains and merchants, elegant ladies in empire waistlines, and gentlemen in Revolutionary War uniforms. The family's history was displayed here like a gallery of achievement, each generation adding to the legacy of wealth and influence that Cornelius had inherited and expanded. The master bedroom was a shrine to wealth and taste. Cornelius Pemberton lay in state on the massive four-poster bed, its mahogany frame carved with maritime motifs that celebrated the family's shipping heritage. The bed itself was draped in midnight blue silk, while the body was dressed in Cornelius's finest evening wear, a black tailcoat with silk lapels, starched white shirt with pearl studs, and a silk cravat tied in the precise Windsor knot that had been his trademark in life. The funeral director had done his work well. The corpse appeared peaceful, hands folded across the chest in the traditional pose of repose, grey hair combed perfectly and secured with pomade that created an artificial sheen under the gaslight. His face bore the waxy pallor typical of recent embalming, yet the features retained enough of their living character to suggest the formidable personality that had dominated Boston business circles for decades. Yet something struck Hartwell as unusual immediately upon entering the room. The lighting was wrong for the time of day, suggesting the heavy curtains had been drawn for some time, and there was a faint but unmistakable odor of carbolic acid, typically used to mask other scents during the embalming process. More troubling was the arrangement of the room itself. Furniture had been moved to accommodate the photographic session, but the positioning seemed calculated rather than organic, as if someone had spent considerable time planning the visual composition. "The family has specific requests for the positioning," Kraus explained, consulting a piece of paper with handwritten notes in what appeared to be Margaret Pemberton's careful script. "They wish to be photographed individually with Mr. Pemberton, each in poses that reflect their special relationship with the deceased." As if summoned by this explanation, the family members began arriving in the bedroom one by one. Hartwell had encountered grief in many forms during his career, but the Pemberton family's behavior struck him as peculiar from the start. There was an underlying tension in their interactions, quick glances exchanged when they thought he wasn't looking, and a forced quality to their expressions of sorrow that seemed more theatrical than genuine. Margaret Pemberton, the widow, was a handsome woman in her late 50s with steel-grey hair arranged in an elaborate chignon, secured with tortoiseshell combs. Her black mourning dress was expertly tailored in the latest fashion, with jet buttons and intricate beadwork that spoke of considerable expense. But her hands shook as she positioned herself beside the bed. "I want to be photographed holding his hand," she instructed, her voice steady but her eyes darting constantly toward her adult children. "We were married 34 years. No one knew him better than I did." The photography session extended well into the afternoon as each family member insisted on multiple poses and specific arrangements. Hartwell worked methodically, adjusting his lighting apparatus and carefully measuring exposure times for each shot. The process of 19th-century photography required patience and precision. Each glass plate had to be prepared with light-sensitive emulsion in his portable darkroom, exposed for several minutes while subjects remained perfectly still, then immediately developed in his chemical baths before the silver nitrate could deteriorate. Her eldest son, Theodore, was a man of 38, with his father's strong jaw and calculating eyes, though his features lacked the paternal authority that had made Cornelius so formidable in business circles. His mourning attire was impeccable, a black frock coat tailored on Savile Row, silk vest with obsidian buttons, and polished Oxford shoes that reflected the gaslight. Yet Hartwell noticed mud on those expensive shoes, despite the butler's earlier efforts to clean the floors, suggesting Theodore had been outdoors recently in weather that would soil such fine footwear. "I should be photographed with my hand on his shoulder," Theodore declared, his voice carrying the entitled tone of a man accustomed to having his wishes obeyed without question. "As his heir and business partner, I was his right hand in all things." The positioning he requested placed him in a dominant stance beside the bed, his hand resting possessively on Cornelius's shoulder in a gesture that seemed more about claiming ownership than expressing grief. The youngest son, Frederick, barely 25 and bearing little resemblance to his older brother, fidgeted nervously as he waited his turn. Where Theodore projected confidence and authority, Frederick appeared anxious and uncomfortable, his fingers drumming against his thigh in a nervous rhythm that had marked his personality since childhood. His request was for a photograph of himself kneeling beside the bed, a pose that struck Hartwell as unusually submissive for a grown man. "Father always said I was his favorite," Frederick muttered, though his siblings' sharp looks suggested this claim was not only disputed, but actively resented. "I want that remembered." His words carried a defensive quality, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as others of his special status in the family hierarchy. The daughter, Constance, was perhaps 30 years old with dark hair and a complexion that spoke of recent illness or emotional strain. Her mourning dress was fashionable but seemed to hang loosely on her frame, suggesting recent weight loss. Her request was the most unusual. She wanted to be photographed placing a white rose on her father's chest while leaning down as if to kiss his forehead, a pose that struck Hartwell as inappropriately intimate for a woman of her age and social standing. "Daddy always called me his little princess," she said, her voice breaking convincingly with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "Even when I disappointed him with my choice of husband." This reference to marital difficulties added another layer to the family's complex dynamics, suggesting personal conflicts that extended beyond mere business disagreements. As Hartwell set up his equipment for each individual portrait, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was witnessing a performance rather than genuine grief. Each family member seemed more concerned with their pose and its implications than with mourning their patriarch. They spoke in careful, measured tones when addressing him, but their whispered conversations among themselves carried undercurrents of tension and barely concealed hostility. Moreover, there was something about Cornelius Pemberton's appearance that troubled the photographer's experienced eye. The makeup was expertly applied by Boston's finest funeral director, but it seemed heavier than usual, particularly around the neck and hands. The positioning of the body, while technically correct for memorial photography, seemed somehow artificial, as if the limbs had been arranged rather than falling naturally into their final pose. As he worked, fragments of conversation reached his ears despite the family's attempts at discretion. The family members spoke in hushed tones when they thought he was occupied with his equipment, their words carrying undercurrents of tension and accusation that seemed inappropriate for a house of mourning. Margaret whispered urgently to Theodore about changing the will before anyone else finds out, while Frederick muttered something about having to act quickly before the lawyers start asking questions to Constance. Most disturbing were the references to what needed to be done, and ensuring that certain arrangements remained private. These phrases suggested planning and coordination that went far beyond normal funeral preparations. hinting at secrets that the family was desperate to keep hidden from public scrutiny. The butler, Wilhelm Kraus, seemed increasingly nervous as the afternoon progressed, his earlier professional composure gradually giving way to visible anxiety. When Hartwell asked him to adjust the window curtains for better light, the man's hands trembled so badly he nearly dropped the heavy fabric. Beads of perspiration had formed on his forehead, despite the February chill that permeated the house, and his responses to simple questions carried the stammering quality of a man under tremendous stress. "Forgive me," Kraus stammered when he fumbled with the curtain cord. "This has been a most difficult time for the household. Mr. Pemberton's death was so sudden. We are all still adjusting to the shock of his passing." "When did he pass?" Hartwell inquired, genuinely curious about the timeline for his own records and sensing an opportunity to gather more information about the circumstances. Kraus glanced quickly toward the family members before responding, his eyes darting nervously as if seeking permission or guidance. "2 nights ago, sir. In his sleep," the doctor said. "Very peaceful, according to Dr. Morrison, who attended him, though he had complained of stomach pains earlier that evening during dinner." Something about this explanation didn't align with Hartwell's observations, though he couldn't yet articulate exactly what troubled him. If Cornelius had died peacefully in his sleep 2 nights prior, certain aspects of his current appearance seemed inconsistent with such a death. The photographer had developed a keen eye for the signs of different types of death during his years of memorial work, and peaceful deaths typically left distinct characteristics in facial expression and body positioning that seemed absent here. As the afternoon wore on and the photographic session neared completion, Hartwell began preparing to develop the first batch of plates in the mansion's converted pantry, which would serve as his temporary dark room. The servants had cleared the space and installed the necessary equipment according to his specifications, creating a light, tight environment where he could process the glass plates with the toxic but essential chemicals of his trade. The development process itself was almost meditative for Hartwell, a ritual he had perfected through years of practice. In the red-lit darkness of the improvised darkroom, surrounded by the familiar chemical odors of developer and fixer, he carefully immersed each glass plate in solution, watching as images slowly emerged from the chemical bath, like ghosts materializing from another world. This particular batch contained the individual portraits of each family member with Cornelius, and as the pictures became clear under the ruby light, Hartwell began to notice details that had escaped his attention during the actual photography session. The large format plates captured extraordinary detail, every texture and shadow rendered with scientific precision. In Margaret's portrait, where she held her husband's hand in what was meant to appear as a tender farewell gesture, the positioning of Cornelius's fingers seemed awkward and unnatural, as if they had been arranged rather than falling naturally. More disturbing was what appeared to be a small scratch or mark on the back of his hand, barely visible to the naked eye but clearly present, once revealed by the unforgiving accuracy of the photographic process. The scratch was thin and precise, consistent with fingernail marks, rather than accidental injury. Its location suggested defensive movement, the kind of mark that might result from someone trying to pull their hand away from an attacker. Hartwell studied the image carefully, using his magnifying glass to examine every detail, and concluded that the mark was definitely ante-mortem, created while Cornelius was still alive and struggling. Theodore's photograph, with his hand resting possessively on his father's shoulder, captured something even more unusual. The fabric of Cornelius's jacket appeared to be pulled or torn slightly at the shoulder seam, damage that would have been invisible without the magnification provided by the camera's precise optics. More significantly, there was what looked like a small stain on the collar that the funeral makeup hadn't quite concealed, a discoloration that appeared organic rather than accidental. The stain was dark and had penetrated the fabric in a pattern consistent with dried blood. Its location near the neck area was particularly troubling, suggesting injury to a vital area that could have contributed to death. Hartwell had seen enough violence in his work with the police department's occasional forensic photography to recognize the signs of trauma when they appeared. But it was Frederick's portrait that made Hartwell's blood run cold and forced him to sit down heavily in the darkroom single chair. In the kneeling position beside the bed, the angle of the photograph revealed Cornelius's profile more clearly than any of the other shots, capturing details that had been obscured by the lighting during the actual session. What Hartwell saw there defied the explanation of a peaceful death and filled him with growing horror. The expression on the dead man's face was not one of repose, but of unmistakable terror and anguish. His mouth was slightly open, not in peaceful sleep, but as if he had been gasping for air in his final moments. His eyes were not quite fully closed, and beneath the funeral director's careful makeup, there was a tension in his facial muscles that spoke of a death that had been anything but peaceful. The angle also revealed what appeared to be bruising around the neck area, marks that had been carefully concealed by the high collar of his burial shirt. Most disturbing of all was the positioning of Cornelius's hands in Frederick's photograph. While they appeared formally folded in other shots, this angle revealed that the fingers were actually clenched into fists, the knuckles white with rigor mortis. This was not the relaxed pose of natural death, but the defensive position of someone who had fought for their life in their final moments. As Hartwell hung the developed plates to dry, his mind raced through the possibilities and implications of what he had discovered. His professional experience told him that these physical signs were inconsistent with natural death, particularly the peaceful passing that the family and their doctor had described. The scratches, the torn clothing, the expression of terror, the clenched fists, all pointed to a struggle, to a death that had been violent, despite the careful preparation of the body for viewing. The following morning brought fresh snow to Boston, muffling the city's sounds and creating an atmosphere of hushed expectancy that seemed to mirror Hartwell's own sense of foreboding. He arrived early at his studio, eager to examine the developed photographs more closely, in proper lighting, and with the full range of his analytical equipment. What he discovered in those silver nitrate images would haunt him for the remainder of his life and change his understanding of the Pemberton family forever. Under the powerful magnifying glass he used for detailed print work, the evidence became not just suggestive, but undeniable. Cornelius Pemberton's hands showed clear defensive wounds, small cuts and scratches that suggested he had fought desperately for his life in his final moments. The pattern and depth of these marks indicated struggle against human attackers rather than accidental injury or medical intervention. The staining on his collar, barely visible to the naked eye, but captured with merciless clarity by the photographic process, was definitely blood that had been hastily cleaned but not completely removed. Chemical analysis would have confirmed this suspicion, but Hartwell's experienced eye needed no such verification. The pattern and color were unmistakable to someone who had documented crime scenes for the police department. Most damning of all was a detail in Constance's portrait that had escaped notice initially, hidden by the angle and lighting during the actual photography session. As she leaned down to place the white rose on her father's chest, the camera's perspective had captured a clear view of Cornelius's neck area, where her pose had inadvertently displaced the high collar of his burial shirt. There, partially concealed by funeral makeup, but clearly visible in the photograph's unforgiving detail, was what appeared to be finger-shaped bruising consistent with manual strangulation. The bruises formed a pattern that suggested prolonged pressure from strong hands, the kind of marks that would result from someone being strangled slowly and deliberately rather than quickly overwhelmed. The positioning indicated that the attacker had faced their victim, looking into Cornelius's eyes as they squeezed the life from his body. This was not a crime of passion or sudden violence, but a calculated execution carried out with cold determination. Hartwell sat in his studio chair, staring at the photographs spread across his work table like pieces of a deadly puzzle, trying to process the full implications of what he was seeing. These weren't simply memorial portraits documenting a family's grief. They were evidence of murder, captured forever in silver and glass by his own unwitting hand. The Pemberton family hadn't hired him to memorialize their patriarch. They had unknowingly hired him to document their crime in excruciating detail. The implications were staggering and dangerous. If Cornelius Pemberton had been murdered by his own family, the motive was clearly financial. But the stakes went far beyond simple inheritance. The Pemberton fortune was substantial enough to drive people to desperate measures, and Hartwell recalled the whispered conversations about wills and legal arrangements that he had overheard during the photography session. This wasn't just about money. It was about power, social position, and the kind of influence that shaped cities and states. As he pondered his next move, weighing his moral obligations against the very real physical danger he now faced, a knock at his studio door interrupted his thoughts. Through the frosted glass, he could see the silhouette of a well-dressed man wearing an expensive overcoat and carrying a gentleman's walking stick. Hartwell opened the door to find Theodore Pemberton standing on his threshold, hat in hand, and an expression of forced concern on his handsome features. "Mr. Hartwell," Theodore began, his voice carrying the practiced charm of a man accustomed to getting his way through a combination of social pressure and barely concealed threats. "I wanted to personally thank you for your sensitivity yesterday. This is a difficult time for our family, as I'm sure you understand from your experience with other bereaved clients." "Of course," Hartwell replied carefully, stepping back to allow Theodore into the studio, while mentally calculating the distance to the drawer where he kept a loaded revolver for protection against the occasional violent criminal who might object to his police photography work. Theodore's eyes swept the studio with the calculating gaze of a man taking inventory, noting the photographic equipment, the work tables where Hartwell processed his images, and the locked cabinet where he stored completed photographs. His attention lingered on the developing area, as if trying to determine whether the previous day's work had been completed, and what evidence might already exist. "Actually, that's why I'm here," Theodore continued, removing his gloves with deliberate slowness. "My family has been discussing the matter extensively, and we've decided that we would prefer to keep the photographs strictly private. Family only, you understand? We're prepared to pay you handsomely for your discretion and for all copies of the images, including any plates or negatives you may have produced." The offer was generous, more money than Hartwell typically earned in several months of regular work. But Theodore's manner was wrong, too casual for a grieving son, too calculating for someone making a simple business arrangement. Moreover, the request itself was highly unusual. In Hartwell's experience, families commissioned memorial photographs specifically to display them, to share them with friends and relatives as a way of honoring the deceased and demonstrating their devotion. "I appreciate your consideration," Hartwell said diplomatically, buying time while his mind raced through his options. "However, I do keep copies of all my work for portfolio purposes. It's standard practice in my profession, and many of my clients specifically request that their portraits be available for viewing by other potential customers." Theodore's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, the veneer of grief and courtesy slipping just enough to reveal the calculating mind beneath. "I'm afraid that won't be acceptable, Mr. Hartwell. My family values privacy above all else, particularly during our time of mourning. I'm sure you can understand our position and make an exception to your usual practices." There was something in Theodore's tone that made Hartwell deeply uncomfortable, a subtle shift from request to demand that carried the weight of social pressure and implied consequences. This wasn't a negotiation between equals. It was an ultimatum delivered by a man who expected immediate compliance and was prepared to take unpleasant measures if he didn't receive it. "Perhaps we could discuss the terms more specifically," Hartwell said, attempting to maintain the appearance of cooperation while gathering more information about Theodore's intentions. "I would need to consider the financial implications of breaking with my standard practices, and there are professional considerations as well." Theodore smiled, but the expression never reached his eyes, which remained cold and calculating as they continued to study the studio's layout. "Of course, take your time to consider our offer, but please understand that time is somewhat limited. I'll return tomorrow for your answer." He paused at the door, turning back with an afterthought that felt anything but casual. "I should mention that my family has considerable influence in Boston's business community. We value loyalty in our associates, and we remember those who serve us well. Conversely, we have long memories regarding those who disappoint us or fail to understand the delicate nature of certain situations. The threat was delivered with the smooth courtesy of a gentleman, but its meaning was unmistakable. Theodore was offering Hartwell a choice between cooperation and consequences, between accepting their money and facing the full weight of the Pemberton family's considerable power. In a city where business relationships and social connections determined success or failure, such threats carried real weight. After Theodore left, Hartwell locked the studio door and drew the heavy curtains, plunging the workspace into the dim red light he used for photographic development. The photographs lay spread across his work table like evidence in a court trial, each image revealing another aspect of the horrible truth he had uncovered. He was no longer simply a photographer who had captured a family's grief. He was the only person in Boston who possessed physical evidence of the Pemberton family's darkest secret. The next 24 hours passed in a state of mounting dread and careful planning. Hartwell found himself unable to concentrate on routine studio work, instead spending his time studying the photographs and researching everything he could discover about the Pemberton family's finances, business relationships, and personal conflicts. The evidence was clear. Cornelius Pemberton had been murdered, almost certainly by members of his own family. But proving such an accusation against one of Boston's most influential families would require more than photographic evidence, no matter how compelling. His research into the Pemberton family revealed a web of financial pressures and personal conflicts that provided ample motive for murder. Through discreet inquiries at his gentleman's club and carefully worded conversations with fellow businessmen, he learned that Cornelius had been considering significant changes to his will in the weeks before his death. There were rumors of heated arguments about business decisions, disputes over marriages and lifestyle choices, and growing tensions between the aging patriarch and his adult children, who had expected to inherit his empire without interference. Most significantly, Hartwell discovered that Cornelius had recently begun asking pointed questions about irregularities in the family business accounts, inconsistencies that suggested either gross mismanagement or deliberate embezzlement. Theodore, who had managed much of the day-to-day operations for the past several years, was reportedly furious about his father's increased scrutiny and demands for detailed financial records that could expose years of questionable practices. Dawn broke gray and cold over Boston as Edgar Hartwell made his desperate decision, the weight of moral obligation finally overcoming his very reasonable fear for personal safety. The failed attack at his studio had eliminated any possibility of negotiation or compromise with the Pemberton family. He possessed evidence of their crime, and they would certainly kill him to protect their secret rather than risk exposure. His only chance of survival was to expose them before they could silence him permanently, but doing so would require careful planning and multiple safeguards. Hartwell spent the early morning hours making multiple copies of the most incriminating photographs, using his finest photographic paper and most careful techniques to ensure that every detail was preserved with perfect clarity. He prepared 6 complete sets, hiding them in different locations throughout the city like a man distributing pieces of a treasure map. One set went to his banker with sealed instructions that it be opened if anything happened to him, while another was delivered to his sister in Providence, along with a detailed letter explaining the situation and requesting that she contact the authorities if she didn't hear from him within a week. The most dangerous gambit involved taking the original photographs directly to the Boston Police Department, despite his knowledge that the Pemberton family's influence extended throughout the city's power structure, including significant portions of law enforcement. Hartwell hoped that the graphic evidence would be compelling enough to force an official investigation, despite any political pressure or corruption that might protect the family. Detective Inspector Michael O'Brien was a career policeman, with a reputation for honesty and thoroughness that had earned him respect throughout the department. Irish by heritage but Boston-born, he had worked his way up through the ranks, despite the prejudices that limited opportunities for Catholic officers in a predominantly Protestant power structure. When Hartwell appeared at his office with a leather portfolio of photographs, O'Brien initially assumed he was dealing with a routine matter involving insurance fraud or divorce proceedings. The reality was far more shocking than anything the detective had encountered in 20 years of police work. As Hartwell spread the memorial photographs across O'Brien's scarred wooden desk and began pointing out the evidence of violence, the detective's expression grew increasingly grim. The defensive wounds clearly visible on Cornelius's hands, the signs of strangulation around his neck, the expression of terror frozen on his dead face. All were indisputable once attention was directed to them. "This is a serious accusation, Mr. Hartwell," O'Brien said, studying the photographs with a magnifying glass while his assistant took careful notes. "The Pemberton family has considerable influence in this city, connections that reach into every level of government and business. If we pursue this investigation and you're wrong, both our careers will be over before the week is out." "I'm not wrong," Hartwell replied firmly, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was alleging. "Look at the evidence, Detective. That man didn't die peacefully in his sleep as his family claims. He was murdered in his own home by people he trusted, and his killers posed with the body to create an alibi of grief and devotion." O'Brien was ultimately convinced by the photographic evidence, but his years of experience with Boston's complex political landscape made him insist on conducting a discreet preliminary investigation before making any arrests. This caution, while professionally sound, would prove to be a fatal mistake for everyone involved. Within hours of Hartwell's visit to police headquarters, word of the investigation reached the Pemberton family through their extensive network of political allies and corrupt officials who had been placed in key positions throughout the city government. Theodore Pemberton's response was swift, ruthless, and characteristic of a man who had inherited his father's capacity for decisive action when faced with existential threats. Rather than flee Boston or attempt to destroy evidence, he decided to eliminate the threat at its source through direct violence. That evening, as Hartwell walked home from a late dinner at his neighborhood tavern, he was accosted by 3 men in a dark alley near his studio. The attack was vicious and coordinated, planned with the same methodical precision that Theodore brought to his business dealings. 2 men held Hartwell, while the third, whom he recognized with growing horror as the same servant who had attempted to break into his studio, approached with a knife gleaming in the gaslight. The blade was long and sharp, designed not for quick killing but for the kind of slow, painful death that would send a message to anyone else who might consider crossing the Pemberton family. But the photographer had anticipated this possibility and had prepared for it, with the thoroughness that marked all his professional work. Hidden in his coat was a small pistol, a precaution he had taken after the previous night's break-in attempt. The weapon was a Smith & Wesson revolver, compact but deadly at close range, purchased from a gunsmith who asked no questions about his customer's intentions. When the knife-wielding attacker moved close enough, Hartwell broke free from his captors through a combination of desperation and the element of surprise, then drew the weapon with practiced efficiency. The narrow alley erupted in violence as the 3 men struggled to disarm him, their shouts echoing off the brick walls and alerting residents in nearby buildings. In the chaos that followed, shots were fired, muzzle flashes illuminating the scene in brief, hellish bursts of light. When the smoke cleared and the ringing in Hartwell's ears subsided, 2 of his attackers lay dead in pools of blood that reflected the gaslight like dark mirrors, while the third had fled into the night clutching a wounded arm. The photographer himself had sustained a knife wound to his shoulder and numerous bruises from the struggle, but he was alive and conscious when police officers arrived at the scene. The gunshots had attracted attention from nearby residents, and within minutes, uniformed officers were examining the bodies while Detective Inspector O'Brien took Hartwell's statement. Both dead men carried identification linking them to the Pemberton household. They were servants who had been ordered to silence the photographer permanently, their loyalty purchased with gold and their silence guaranteed by death. The failed assassination attempt provided O'Brien with the justification he needed to move against the Pemberton family despite their political connections. Armed with warrants signed by a judge who owed no favors to the family, and supported by evidence from both the photographs and the dead assassin's connection to the household, police surrounded the Beacon Hill mansion just before midnight. What they found inside completed the picture of the Pemberton family's guilt and revealed the full extent of their desperation to conceal their crime. Margaret Pemberton was discovered in her husband's study, frantically burning business documents and personal papers in the fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows on her tear-streaked face as she destroyed evidence of their financial crimes. The papers included bank records, correspondence with corrupt officials, and most damning of all, a detailed plan for disposing of Cornelius's body in a way that would prevent any future examination. Theodore was found attempting to flee through the mansion's service entrance, carrying a leather satchel filled with gold coins and bearer bonds worth thousands of dollars. His plans had included immediate departure for New York, then passage on a steamship to Europe, where the family's crimes would be beyond the reach of American law. The discovery of travel documents and tickets confirmed that the entire family had been prepared to abandon their lives in Boston rather than face justice. Frederick and Constance were located in the mansion's wine cellar, where they had been hiding since learning of their hired killer's failure earlier that evening. Both were in a state of near hysteria, Frederick weeping uncontrollably, while Constance maintained the rigid composure that had characterized her behavior throughout the ordeal. Among their possessions, police found additional evidence including Cornelius's original will, which would have left the majority of his fortune to charitable causes rather than his family. The arrest of Boston's most prominent family sent shockwaves through the city's social elite and dominated newspaper headlines for weeks. As news of the murder spread beyond the immediate circle of witnesses and investigators, other dark secrets began to surface like bodies rising from deep water. The family's business practices were revealed to be far more corrupt than anyone had suspected, involving embezzlement, fraud, and systematic exploitation of immigrant workers who had no legal recourse against their powerful employers. The trial of the Pemberton family became the most sensational legal proceeding in Boston's history, drawing spectators from across New England and newspaper correspondents from major cities throughout the country. Edgar Hartwell's photographs served as the primary evidence, their stark black and white imagery telling the story of murder more effectively than any witness testimony could have achieved. The images were displayed on easels in the courtroom, allowing jurors to examine every detail of the violence that had been inflicted on Cornelius Pemberton. The defense attorneys, among the finest legal minds that money could retain, argued desperately that the images were misleading, that the apparent signs of violence could be explained by natural post-mortem changes or standard embalming procedures. They brought in medical experts who testified about the effects of rigor mortis and the chemical processes that occurred after death, attempting to create reasonable doubt about the photographic evidence. However, the prosecution's case was strengthened by additional evidence uncovered during the investigation that followed the family's arrest. The family physician who had signed Cornelius's death certificate was revealed to have been paid a substantial sum to falsify the cause of death, his bank records showing a deposit of $500 made the day after the alleged natural death. Under pressure from prosecutors, he eventually confessed to the falsification and agreed to testify against his former clients. Wilhelm Krauss, the German butler whose nervous behavior had been noted by Hartwell during the photography session, proved to be the prosecution's most valuable witness. Facing charges as an accessory to murder, he agreed to provide detailed testimony in exchange for immunity from prosecution. His account of the murder was methodical and damning, delivered in heavily accented English that nonetheless conveyed the horror of what he had witnessed. According to Krauss's testimony, the family had gathered for dinner on the night of February 14, 1887, ostensibly to celebrate Cornelius's 73rd birthday. The patriarch had become increasingly suspicious of irregularities in the family business accounts over the preceding weeks, and had announced his intention to conduct a comprehensive audit that would certainly expose years of embezzlement and fraud. More immediately threatening to his family's interests, he had declared his intention to change his will, cutting off those family members he believed were stealing from him and leaving the majority of his fortune to charitable causes. The murder itself was a collaborative effort that demonstrated the family's capacity for calculated evil. Margaret had prepared a special birthday cake, incorporating enough arsenic to make her husband violently ill, but not immediately fatal. The poison was intended to create the symptoms of natural illness that would explain his subsequent death. As Cornelius writhed in agony from the poison, doubled over with stomach cramps and nausea, Theodore had strangled him with a silk necktie, while Frederick and Constance held his arms to prevent him from defending himself. The death had been agonizing and terror-filled, lasting several minutes, as Cornelius realized that his own family was murdering him for his money. His final moments were spent looking into the faces of the people he had loved and provided for, understanding at last the depth of their greed and the price of his trust. The defensive wounds on his hands had been inflicted as he struggled desperately against his children's grip, while the expression of terror captured in Hartwell's photographs reflected his final realization of their betrayal. The family's plan had been simple but effective, relying on their social position and the natural reluctance of authorities to question the powerful. They would claim that Cornelius had died peacefully in his sleep after complaining of stomach pains, produce a medical certificate confirming natural causes, and proceed with a quick private funeral that would preclude any detailed examination of the body. The memorial photographs were intended to support their narrative of grief and devotion, creating a visual record that would deflect any future suspicions about their father's death. They had not anticipated that their photographer would possess the skill and experience to recognize the signs of murder preserved in silver and glass, nor that he would have the moral courage to pursue justice despite the personal risk and professional consequences. The very technology they had employed to create false evidence of their innocence had instead documented their guilt with scientific precision. The verdicts were unanimous and swift. Margaret, Theodore, and Constance Pemberton were found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by hanging, their execution scheduled for the following autumn. Frederick, whose participation had been limited to restraining his father during the strangulation, received a sentence of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The family's vast fortune was seized by the state under laws governing criminal forfeiture, eventually being distributed to various charitable causes after legal expenses were paid. The executions were carried out on a grey October morning in 1888, witnessed by a crowd of spectators that included many of Boston's social elite who had once considered the Pembertons their equals. Margaret maintained her composure to the end, while Theodore and Constance required physical support to mount the scaffold. Their deaths marked the end of one of New England's most prominent families and served as a stark reminder that wealth and social position offered no protection against the consequences of evil. Edgar Hartwell survived his injuries and continued his photography business, though he never again accepted commissions for memorial portraits. The trauma of discovering murder through his art had fundamentally changed his relationship with death and photography, leaving him unable to view deceased subjects without searching for signs of violence or foul play. He focused instead on landscape and architectural work, finding peace in subjects that could not conceal hidden horrors or family secrets. Detective Inspector O'Brien was promoted to Chief of Detectives, his handling of the Pemberton case establishing his reputation as one of Boston's finest investigators. He often cited the case as an example of how modern investigative techniques, combined with emerging technologies like photography, could uncover crimes that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. The case established important precedents regarding the use of photographic evidence in criminal proceedings and helped establish photography as a legitimate forensic tool. The Pemberton mansion on Beacon Hill was sold at auction following the family's conviction, eventually becoming a boarding house for immigrants seeking affordable housing in the city's most prestigious neighborhood. Local residents reported strange sounds and unsettling atmospheres in the building, though these were likely the result of the house's notorious history rather than any supernatural influence. By 1900, the building had been demolished and replaced with a more modest residential structure that bore no trace of its dark past. Wilhelm Krauss disappeared after the trial, presumably returning to Germany with enough money to live comfortably for the remainder of his life. His testimony had been crucial in securing the convictions, but his role in the murder's cover-up made him a pariah in Boston's German immigrant community. Some reports suggested he had changed his name and settled in the Midwest, while others claimed he had died during the ocean crossing back to his homeland. The case established important precedents in American legal history regarding the use of photographic evidence in criminal proceedings. Hartwell's memorial photographs became some of the first images to be accepted as primary evidence in a murder trial, paving the way for the development of forensic photography as a professional discipline. Law enforcement agencies across the country began incorporating photographic documentation into their investigative procedures, recognizing its value in preserving evidence that might otherwise be lost or disputed. Perhaps most significantly, the Pemberton murders demonstrated how emerging technology could reveal truths that human observation might miss or deliberately overlook. The camera's unflinching accuracy captured details that the naked eye had missed or that had been deliberately concealed, providing evidence that was impossible to dispute or explain away through clever legal arguments or political influence. Edgar Hartwell lived for another 32 years, dying peacefully in his sleep in 1919. His obituary made brief mention of his role in solving Boston's most notorious murder case, but focused primarily on his contributions to the art of photography and his extensive documentation of New England's changing architectural landscape. He never married, perhaps unable to trust in human relationships after witnessing the depths of family betrayal that the Pemberton case had revealed. The photographs that had exposed the Pemberton family's crime were eventually donated to the Massachusetts Historical Society, where they remain today as a grim reminder of how the pursuit of wealth and power can corrupt even the most fundamental human bonds. They serve as testament to the truth that no secret, however carefully guarded, can remain hidden forever when exposed to the revealing light of justice and the uncompromising eye of the camera. This mystery shows us that even in an era before modern forensic science, careful observation of physical evidence could expose the most carefully planned crimes. The Pemberton family believed that their wealth and social position would protect them from scrutiny, but they underestimated both the power of photographic truth and the courage of an ordinary man who refused to be silenced by threats and violence. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the Pemberton family's secrets? Or might there have been other victims of their greed? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about how photography changed criminal investigation forever. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories from America's dark past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries. See you in the next video.